Shepherd Revolution.
Hey, this is David, and welcome to Shepherd Revolution Podcast. We're continuing our series, Teaching to Change Lives, and we're going to switch it up today. I'm sitting down with a good friend of mine named Zach, and Zach is a father. He is an inspiring pastor. He has a heart of a pastor. He's a future community leader, and he is working in the insurance industry. Zach, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, David. It's an absolute honor.
Awesome. So as we're talking about teaching to change lives, and I prompted you the night before, and I was like, hey, I think I want to have you on the show. And when you were processing with the Father this morning, teaching to change lives, like what came to mind for you?
Yeah, teaching to change lives, I thought of the master teacher, Jesus. And he is the master communicator, and I think he is the example for anyone that wants to change lives. How do you impart transformation?
Yeah.
And as I thought about it, the one thing that stands out with who he is was that he embodied his message. The word became flesh and dwelled among us. So he didn't just speak a message, he embodied, and he was able to impart who he was to other people. So it wasn't just about information, it was about who he was that he brought to the table, and it was his life lived that spoke the message, and people can grasp a life lived instead of just information relayed.
So embodiment, so when I think about the word embodiment, and oftentimes in communication, the biggest miscommunication is that it's taking place. So something that I do with my learners is that if I say a word, we have to describe the word without saying the word. So when I say the word embodiment, what does that mean to you without saying the word?
That's a great question. Let's get to the definition, the heart of what it means. So I would say it's to live out, to flesh out, to be a part of, from your being, doing.
Yeah.
It's a great question. I haven't thought a whole lot, so spur of the moment, let's just dive in.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes like I go in and I'm just fascinated about words. And when you think of embodiment, if you were to ask me that question, I would think it's who we become. Embodiment is becoming, and it's became and becoming at the same time, right? I became love and I'm becoming love. So my love is growing and my love is, and when I think of embodiment, it's becoming and it's became. So I don't know how that resonates with you, but yeah, I ask very deep questions because my goal as a student, I see myself as a student of education. I want to understand. I just don't want to know something, because we can know what to do, but if we don't understand what to do, there's usually a gap in the application part of the implementation. So when you see embodiment and you're talking about becoming and being in the word that you got today, how does embodiment look?
I think it's just living your life out loud in front of someone. Like, the other word that comes to mind is incarnate, to become something, to embody a presence and a message, but it has to become a part of me before it can flow from me. I can't impart what I haven't received. I can't give something I don't possess. So I really believe embodiment is about being a really good receiver. Like, go long, time to receive. Because if I haven't received it, I can't impart it. And I think being a communicator is about being an excellent receiver, like you are, a student, a constant lifelong learner, someone who never arrives, that's always going for more. And I think that's what I love about Jesus, is he is infinite. I'm finite. I'll never arrive. There's always more to discover. And that hunger and that joy of pursuit produces that embodiment that is contagious to others, because if something really is impacting me, I get passionate about it. I get fired up. And that's what Jesus incarnated, that excitement it was able to be imparted through stories. He didn't just relay a message and information. He had an intent. I think that's what people feel. They feel the intent of someone's heart when they're communicating. Not information can be very impactful, but I've heard it said, people don't remember what you say. They remember how you made them feel. And that flows from the heart, from an intent. What am I trying to do with this message? People feel that, especially in our age. I think people have become a lot more discerning to see through facades and to see the heart. Why is this person sharing this?
That is so true. Yeah, and so there may be people who are listening, and they don't necessarily align with your belief of, believing that Jesus is the one who teaches to change lives. What are some concepts, right? Because we can, religion has done a phenomenal job of creating division, right? Rituals. And so if we could put that aside, what are some concepts that Jesus taught that is transferable, that breaks both religional barriers, political barriers, race barriers? Like, what are some concepts that he taught that we can actually implement to teach to change lives?
That's a great question. I love that question because it's about connection. I think communicating for connection versus communicating for the sake of information, or like, oh, look at me, I know all this stuff. So what I see about Jesus' life is he communicated to connect with the people. He used very specific things in their world and said, hey, look at this. Look at the birds of the air. They neither reap nor sow, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. How much more valuable are you? So using object lessons, I think a master teacher knows how to use the things around someone that relate and connect and resonate in their world in a way that it reaches their heart, because stories bypass the mind and go to the heart. And it's like, oh, I feel that. It isn't just information. And I think that transcends all barriers. Stories are common throughout all cultures, backgrounds, people, leaders in general. A good leader knows how to share a story and creates this feeling that brings someone in so they see their own story within the story. And I think that's what he mastered, that transcends all those barriers regardless of what someone feels or thinks about Jesus. I think that's a transcendent principle that his life embodied. Learning how to share a message through a story.
Learning how to share a message through a story. And I think that's so powerful. You mentioned master teacher. And for those of individuals who don't know the story of Jesus, there was a section of the Bible in the beginning where up to age 12, we heard of his story and we learned what he did and his mom and his stepdad. And then there was a section of his story that went missing, where no one really heard about him. And then he came back into the scene around the age of 30. And when we think about teaching to change lives, oftentimes we are looking for the result versus the process. And when we're talking about communicating to connect, there was a space and time in history where we didn't hear about him. He was developing, he was learning, he was cultivating his education, just like in the good book talk about Paul, before he went out to ministry.
That's right.
There was a time and section that he had to learn before he could lead. He had to learn before he could teach. And you talk about master teaching, like what does it mean to fall in love with the process versus the outcome?
That's a great question, and I think it's one of the most liberating things that I discovered in this last year, is learning to enjoy and savor the process. Instead of being destination driven, being process focused, of living in the moment. And I love Corey Asbury's song Father's House. He says that arrival's not the end game, the journey's where you are. You never want it perfect, you just want it in my heart. So seeing the process is actually the whole point. The purpose is found in the process. It's not found in, okay, I finally arrived, I've finally become something. And that's what I love when you say aspiring pastor. being a pastor is an embodiment of who someone is. It's not just a title or a job. At least a true pastor, a shepherd, like this podcast, Shepherd Revolution. A shepherd is someone that cares for people. They don't need a paycheck. They don't need a title. It's who they are. So it's an embodiment. But master teacher, it is a process. Just like you said, Paul, 3 years in the wilderness, he just disappears off the grid. Just like in Star Wars, you go off the grid and there's a development. I think of with Yoda, where Luke is off the grid and he's being developed. In every story, there's a process, and that process is actually one of the most beautiful. Majority of our life is process, not arrival.
I love that. And you mentioned master teacher, so it takes a process. And if we're to extract some of the nuggets and the application that we can actually implement, it's communicating to connect. And you're talking about, going away for some time. You mentioned Yoda, you mentioned Jesus, you mentioned Paul, right? The power of solitude gives us clarity, and oftentimes we're getting caught up in the busyness of life and the actions of life, the worries of life. But in order to be a master, you mentioned that you have to have that intent in your heart. So we have to be intentional. So if anyone is writing notes right now, intentionality, communicating to connect, solitude, falling in love with the process and not so much the outcome, is how we can create a path and create a culture where lives are changed. And more importantly, we're teaching in a way that lives are transformed. What stood out to you?
I would say the biggest thing that stands out is, I would say, really creating a culture, a culture of connection. I really believe that that's where true transformation occurs. When someone feels that they are valuable. A genuine master teacher imparts value and sees value and brings it out of that other person. So when I see someone with their creative value, regardless of where they are in the process, it then leads to this connection, and then they become a change agent of connection with others. So as they receive, they then become an imparter of that very same thing. So effective communication and effective leadership is creating a ripple and a wave that then passes on and transcends even those being taught. As Jesus, he created this wave that's still being felt thousands of years later, that we're sitting here in the 21st century having a conversation. Says a lot about how he imparted by embodying his message, communicating to connect. And if you don't mind, I'm going to throw in, I thought of this morning, Communicating for a Change by Andy Stanley. That was one of the first steps in the process of the 7 principles he lays out. The message has to become a part of you. Has to go deep, and there's that process of stepping away to then be able to flow from it. So there's this process within that results in this wave that goes out. So it happens within to then go out.
Wow. That's so amazing. You mentioned a master teacher has to see the value in themselves and then see the values and see the value in other. And that's another nugget, right? Teaching to change life essentially means I see the value in you. It doesn't mean you have to have completed your process. It's seeing the value in the process, seeing the value in the person, and more importantly, seeing the value in the purpose, right? So when we have all 3 of those things, now as a master teacher, we're constantly learning, constantly developing, and communicating in a way that we're becoming, right? So if I say I'm loving, I have to embody love. If I'm gracious, I have to embody grace. If I'm compassionate, I have to embody compassion, right? So oftentimes we talk about doing versus being, and what you're talking about is being versus doing. But when we're focusing on being, it becomes the natural thing to do.
Exactly. For my being, I always do. What I believe about myself, I then flow from.
Yeah.